specifically. In the downtown east side of Vancouver, I never had a single female patient who had not been sexually abused as a child, and as there were many other men. And so it's always, the heart of addiction is always emotional loss. And the obvious ones are those losses incurred by those adverse childhood experiences identified in this California study. But there's another side to it as well. Because if you look at what's happening with this burgeoning number of children being diagnosed with this or that disorder, not all of them were abused, many of them were not, but what's going on? Well, as D.W. Winnicott, the great British child psychiatrist, pointed out, there's two things that can go wrong in childhood. First of all, when things happen that shouldn't happen, and that's the abuse and the trauma. And secondly, when things don't happen that should happen, and that's the presence of non-stressed, non-depressed, emotionally attuned, available caregivers. That's not available in a country where the average maternity leave is 6.5 weeks. That's not available where kids spend most of the time away from the nurturing adults in their lives in the company of other kids, so that they're forced to look to each other as their attachment figures. The desperation of kids to always connect, the sense of disorientation they feel when they can't connect with their friends by some electronic means. It's not a technological problem, it's an attachment problem. Those kids have been disconnected from the adults in their lives because the adults are not there for them. They can't be, they're too stressed. And there was a study a few weeks ago that showed that stressed parents, not unloving parents, but stressed parents simply are not as attuned to the emotional cues of their kids as they'd like to be. And that's what the psychologist formerly at UCLA, Alan Shore, calls proximal separation. Proximal separation is when the parent is physically there, but emotionally unavailable because they're too stressed and too distracted. And that's what my children experienced when they were small, because I was a workaholic physician. And this society rewards workaholism. They tell you what a great guy you are. They reward you for the very things that undermine the health of your family. And for a lot of people, it's not even a question of a choice. When under the sainted and behaloed Bill Clinton, the welfare laws were changed so that mothers could have only a number of years on welfare, then they had to go to work. Now, where exactly does a single welfare mother go to work? Well, usually at a low-paying job far away from home where she has to commute for an hour or two. And all that time that she's working, and all that time that she's commuting, her child is in some daycare, inadequately staffed, with undertrained personnel. Well, who does that kid got to connect to then? The other kids. And the children become each other's connection foci. And that means that for the first time in history, you have large numbers of kids, immature creatures, getting them modeling in their cue giving and their sense of direction and sense of values and how to walk and how to talk from other immature creatures. Well, what do you expect in that culture but all kinds of dysfunction? And again, that's not an individual choice that parents have made. That's just another way in which this system has undermined the necessary conditions for child development. A study out of Notre Dame University last year showed that the healthiest environment actually for child rearing is the hunter-gatherer society, hunter-gatherer village. And why? Because in the hunter-gatherer village, three things happen to kids that don't happen in our culture anymore for many, many kids. Number one, the kid's always with the parent. Well, that's not possible in this country. You know, civilized countries actually have paternity leave. Never mind the 6-week maternity leave. When the Puritans arrived in North America, they were appalled at the parenting practices of the natives. Do you know why? Because the natives didn't beat their kids. And to the Christians, this meant sparing the rod, spoiling the child. So that's the first thing. The second thing is when kids cried, they were picked up. Imagine that, picking up a kid when he's crying. We're telling people at 5 months, when kids are 5 months, 6 months, don't pick them up, you want them to become independent. We're missing the point that the way to promote independence is to invite dependence. Because people become independent when they feel secure in the world. So you promote independence by inviting dependence. But so these Aboriginal cultures, they picked up kids when they were crying, which meant that the kids' brains don't become overwhelmed by the stress hormones. When a child's brain becomes overwhelmed by stress hormones because he's not picked up, that has all kinds of impacts on the child's brain development, because the brain develops an interaction with the environment. So even if you don't abuse kids in this country, but if you just follow the parenting practices recommended by the so-called experts, you're going to screw up your kids tremendously. And the third quality of the hunter-gatherer society is that children were brought up in the context of nurturing adults, not just the parents, not just the father, not just the mother, but that clan, tribe, community, and neighborhood that I was talking about before. So any system that destroys those conditions, that stresses the parents. See, if we think it's genetic, we don't have to ask what happened to black people in this country, and what are the stresses on black males that trigger their prostate cancers. We don't have to look at what happened to the native people in this country that triggers their addictions, or to many other people, native or black or Caucasian or whoever. It's all in the genes is an explanation for the way things are that does not threaten the way things are. Why should someone feel unhappy or engage in antisocial behavior when that person is living in the freest and most prosperous nation on earth? It can't be the system. There must be a flaw in the wiring somewhere. And finally, let me just read you a quote from another chapter of my book on addiction. Detective Sergeant Paul Gillespie, head of Toronto's Sex Crimes Unit, rescued children from the purveyors of internet pornography. As the Globe and Mail reported on his retirement from police work, 6 years at that job had not inured him to the horrors that he witnessed. And this guy made it his job to find out where in the world was it happening that this child was being abused on the net. Then he retired, and a newspaper wrote, Paul Gillespie still can't get used to the sounds of crying and pain in the graphic videos of children being raped and molested that he has seen all too often on the web. It's beyond horrible to listen to the soundtracks of these movies, said Canada's best-known child porn cop. But it is the silent images of desolate children that tear most at his heart. They're not screaming, just accepting, he said, of the infants captured in these pictures. They have dead eyes. You can tell that their spirit is broken. That's their life. Why the dead eyes? The dead eyes because the child can't escape, fight back, or seek help. The only way that they can possibly endure the trauma is to shut down their emotion and awareness of the pain. In this society, we have a massive emotional shutdown. And you can see it in the increasing violence in the culture. You can see it in the increasing violence in the media culture, that gory movies have to be more and more gory. Sports have to be more violent. People now have to beat each other to a pulp on television. Because we're so emotionally shut down, it takes more and more to titillate us. And the sex has to be more and more objectified, more and more salacious, really, because what used to excite people decades ago is no longer sufficient. Why? Because we're shutting down. And why are we shutting down? Because we're hurt so much. And the more we shut down, the more we need external sources of stimulation to make us feel anything at all. Now, in the case of the abused child, of course, the shutdown is obvious as to why it's happening. But the second point is that if that same cop, instead of quitting the force, had transferred to the drug squad, according to all the research, who do you think he'd be chasing in the streets? Those same kids that he didn't rescue. Because according to all the research and the brain developmental data, they're the ones who become the street drug addicts. Because they're the ones who are in so much pain that they have to soothe themselves with drugs. And then what do? We take people who are abused to start with, and then we make them the social enemy. And they're the ones who make up our jail population. So when we try and rescue them if we can, and if we fail to rescue them, then we persecute them for the rest of their lives. And that's what we're doing with this war on drugs. And there's no war on drugs, because you can't war on inanimate objects. There's only a war on drug addicts, which means that we're warring on the most abused and vulnerable segments of the population. And we could argue left and right what a failure the war on drugs has been, because you can see that it's not working. But you know what? I have a different point of view. If decade after decade after decade, the stated intentions of our policies are not being realized, in fact, the very opposite is happening, then is it really a failure? Or maybe is it serving some purpose? Maybe it's serving the purpose of maintaining the rationale, the raison d'etre of law enforcement and a repressive apparatus that can be used against the people when the need arises. Maybe it has the function of demonizing a certain section of the population and increasing the fear in the rest of the population that justifies more repression. Maybe it has the function of keeping a whole legal apparatus going. Maybe it has the function of making a lot of money for a lot of people. Maybe it has the function of fueling the privatized incarceration industry. So maybe after all it's not such a failure at all. And from that perspective, was the Vietnam War a failure? No, it wasn't. It was lost militarily, but the end result was that the U.S. still gets to control the economies of Southeast Asia. Is the Iraq War a failure? Well, it is for the people who died there, for the 500,000 Iraqis or 1 million whose lives were lost, but it's not a failure for the American oil companies. So that every war, we have to be careful before we call them failures. Somebody wins. The somebody who wins are the same people who are destroying neighborhoods and communities. It's the same system that undermines human health, that undermines human dignity, that undermines human connection, that really makes life less tolerable on our planet. Now, we don't have to agree on what the solutions might be, and that's okay. What we do agree on is the importance of speaking the truth. What we do agree on is the importance of people getting together and struggling in a healthy way for a different life. Because if it's the loss of control and the isolation and the suppression of self-expression that are the greatest causes of stress, then surely one answer to the stress of this culture is to get together and to express ourselves and not to be silent and to connect with other human beings. Or as Joe Hill said, don't mourn, organize. Thank you very much. Not all of them were abused, many of them were not, but what's going on? Well, as D.W. Winnicott, the great British child psychiatrist, pointed out, there's two things that can go wrong in childhood. First of all, when things happen that shouldn't happen, and that's the abuse and the trauma. And secondly, when things don't happen that should happen, and that's the presence of non-stressed, non-depressed, emotionally attuned, available caregivers. That's not available in a country where the average maternity leave is 6.5 weeks. That's not available where kids spend most of the time away from the nurseries, emotional loss. And the obvious ones are those losses incurred by those adverse childhood experiences identified in this California study. But there's another side to it as well. Because if you look at what's happening with this burgeoning number of children being diagnosed with this or that disorder, specifically, in the downtown east side of Vancouver, I never had a single female patient who had not been sexually abused as a child. And as there were many other men. And so it's always, the heart of addiction is always